and welcome back to Stellar Journeys. My name is Kat and the guy with the muffin is Ash. So far, we've covered the development of human space movement, starting from Sputnik and growing into a private industry. As we get closer to life in space, there are many factors that we need to consider. For instance, on Earth, each government is responsible for their own laws. If I steal the muffin here, there's no real punishment. But in space, who makes the laws?
So the governance portion is really interesting because everyone likes to think that space is lawless, woohoo, it's the final frontier. And that's not true at all. We have what we call, we have the Outer Space Treaty, which many people think of as like the Magna Carta of space law.
If we were to have a community on the moon, then the legal framework is complex, but there are important questions to ask. And some of the words that you use in your introduction are actually quite key. So the idea that there is a community is important, that there are several nations involved on the moon is important, that you're talking about, I think you used the phrase, one human family. That's important. And the idea that there might be citizens of the moon is also important. Then there's also a question of whose laws apply on the moon or Mars or wherever you are. Now, under international space law, there's a relatively simple solution to that question. If you as a nation register a space object, then your laws apply to that space object and to the people in that space object. Now, if you're talking about a moon station, then you may have multiple nations involved in constructing and occupying that moon station. So the question is, who would register the moon station? Which particular nation would register the moon station?
How do we transition from that's a Chinese base, that's a US base, that's a Russian base, into this is a human community on the moon? And so that's what we have to think about in terms of governance. And that's why I don't think it's a good idea for us here on Earth to say, these are the rules that are going to apply on the moon. Because you know what? We don't know what it's like to wake up in the morning and see the Earth in the window instead of the moon on the horizon, right? We have no idea what that's going to feel like. We have no idea what kind of emotions that will bring. Hopefully, Frank White's overview effect will be true. If you look back at Earth, and you see that all of the borders are things that we made up, and we realize we're all on this together, then that's what will prevail on the moon as well. And so my belief is the least amount of governance that we can, let's work to prevent conflict in space, let's work to be transparent in space, let's work to be responsible in space, and then hopefully our space brethren, our spacefaring culture will help us learn to be peaceful with each other here on Earth.
In the scenario where Kat steals the muffin, if she continues to steal the muffin, it is a problem on the moon potentially, because food, like many other resources, are in short supply. The muffin is probably not particularly serious, but still any food is in short supply. And if they're going to be strict, they might be strict enough to detain Kat, to detain her in her quarters, for example. So if you're talking about criminal activity on the moon, for example, certain things are going to be important on the moon. An airlock, for example, is going to be very important on the moon. And if someone were to, say, jam an airlock, then that would be a risk to the lives of the whole community on the moon. And you would want to do something about that. Now, if you have a police force, you might need a police force on the moon to investigate, to find out what somebody has done, to be able to do something to prevent them from continuing to do it, to arrest them, to bring them to justice, to deter them from doing it anymore, to protect the community and to deter others from doing anything. But it's not just in respect of criminal activity, it's also, for example, disputes between private individuals and corporations on the moon. So talking about the airlock again, if there's a contract to maintain the airlock and two companies are in competition for that, then a dispute might arise between them. And the question is how you resolve that dispute. And so that implies you need a court system.
We should not be thinking about the moon as just a resource that we can use and here's my muffin, here's your muffin. Let's pretend that the moon has 12 muffins and we have to share all of them. And not only that, whatever we don't use of the muffin, all that waste, we've got to reuse that waste. This is going to be a very different kind of environment. And so a lot of people liken it to Antarctica, but the difference between the moon and Antarctica is we can still get to Antarctica pretty quickly, right? It's going to take 3 days to get to the moon. So if you make it through all your muffins and you don't save any for later, that's it, you're done. So we really need to think about how that structure is going to be. And that's why we have to think about the moon differently in terms of governance. And that's why, again, I think we see peace from space, because when we're talking about limited resources, one of the things that the Artemis Accords does is it asks for standardization, right? If we have two bases on the moon, if we have an Artemis community and we have a Chinese community, what if they need to borrow oxygen from each other? Well, we don't want to spend all that time, trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, right? They ought to be able to fit together already. So when we think about muffins and taking muffins, you know what? You can't take somebody's muffin on the moon. You just can't. It would be silly because then you're taking muffins from yourself as well. And so we really have to think differently about how we look at these resources.
So no matter where we are, I'm probably best just not being rude and just asking you to share your muffin, right?
Yeah, but if we were to look at something a bit bigger than stealing a muffin, what rules should dictate our actions? For example, if we were to begin mining on Mars, what would our obligations be to the environment? Who gets to decide this?
In terms of commercial operations on the moon or Mars or on some other celestial body potentially, and commercial operation potentially that could support a community. Well, in order to support that community, the commercial entity would need to undertake some mining activity potentially to mine some water to provide oxygen and water and rocket fuel, would need to maybe use some of the regolith, the soil, if you like, or the dirt on the celestial body, whether it's the moon or Mars. Using the regolith, they can create structures. They could do, for example, 3D printing.
And when we think about mining on the moon or mining on Mars, we're really also thinking about the sharing of benefits. It's supposed to be freedom of access to space for all. And space is supposed to be used, it's the province of all humankind. It should be used for the benefit of all humankind. And so what does that mean if one company is extracting resources and gaining profit from it? How do we make sure that all of humanity is benefiting from it? Well, one thing we know is that everybody has benefited from space. There's not one nation, there might be one or two people on Earth who have not received a benefit from space, but there's not one nation in the world that has not relied on satellite, whether for ATM machine, whether for the Earth observation, for weather, whether for GPS. Every single human on Earth, I'm going to say every single human on Earth has benefited from space in some way. So that's your shared benefit. Even if it's a company, a private company doing something and earning a profit, that is also providing a benefit. That's giving us another avenue to space. That's opening up space again. That's innovating in a way.
Now, if they're going to do that, the question is which companies have a right to do the mining, right? So the question of which companies have a right to do the mining is a complex and controversial one in space law at the moment. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says essentially that no nation can claim any property rights or sovereignty over any part of outer space. Now that's a pretty broad phrase, and some would draw a distinction between, on the one hand, claiming some sort of ownership or property rights over a whole celestial body versus extracting some minerals from that celestial body without necessarily claiming any ownership over it. And the analogy that is used is when you take fish from the high seas, it's not as though you're claiming ownership over the high seas, but you are taking fish from the high seas, you're extracting fish from the high seas. And using that analogy, some states, some nations, such as the United States and Luxembourg and the United Arab Emirates, have taken the position that Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty does not prevent them from having property rights over extracted resources. And that's pretty important if a commercial entity, a commercial mining entity, for example, is looking for a reward for the enormous risk that they're going to take in developing the means to undertake mining operations. So it's pretty important that there is some reward for them.
How are we going to protect Mars? What does it even mean to protect Mars, right? What if we find microbes on Mars? Does that mean we can't colonize it? We can't go settle there because we might mess up the evolution of this organism? You know, when you think back to Star Trek, that was the prime directive. If you see there's a life form, don't interrupt it. Don't get involved with it. Move away. Let it evolve on its own. Is that really what we want? If Mars holds the first, our first stepping stone to another future, what if we get to Europa and there are fish there? So when we think about planetary protection, when we think about harmful contamination of other planets, what we really want to think about is, again, not this no, no, no. That first of all, that doesn't work. If you say no, people still do it anyway. And then you have less control over those people who are doing it anyway. We say, do it responsibly. Let's stop and take steps slowly. Let's stop and think about what we're doing. Let's look at these microbes on Mars. People are talking about terraforming Mars. What does that mean? That means actually redoing the entire planet. Well, should we do that? I don't know. If we do that, should we be saving some part of the original Mars so that we know what it looked like, like a national park, or I guess it would be a universal park? But then how would you save one piece of Mars in its pristine condition? These are questions that really need to be discussed because there are no actual real answers. There's no real solutions. There are balances. And when we think about balancing, and we need to get a lot of people involved. We need the entire international community thinking about this. We need the public thinking about it because these are very real questions that have a lot to do with who are we as humans and what do we want to be as we strike out through the universe.
Most of our laws here on Earth should be relatively transferable to life in space, but we are always going to come up against some unique situations. Where something might seem really trivial here, like stealing Ash's muffin, these issues must be considered as we begin living in space.
Next time, we look at exoplanets and how close we are to finding another home on this stellar journey.
See you next time.
Bye.